Welcome to the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. Doctors change lives every day, but what happens when life changes yours? A single injury, a sudden illness, your career, your income, your future can shift in an instant. The best physicians don't just plan for success, they protect it. At Set for Life Insurance, they believe financial security isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. True own occupation disability insurance ensures that no matter what happens, your future stays in your hands. Because protecting your income means protecting everything you've built. Visit drpodcastnetwork.co/set for life today. Secure your future before life makes the choice for you. We have Megana Helder, Dr. Megana Helder with us today, and I'm so pleased that you're here. Dr. Helder, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Thank you, Dr. Crane, for asking me to come on and share my experiences. Um, it really, I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon in Minneapolis, did all of my training at Mayo. And I'm about 6 years in practice, so 6 years out of fellowship. And I have two little kids, a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old, both girls. And I'm married. My partner is a real estate attorney, and I guess I can't forget I have a 12-year-old dog. That was our very first baby. So,
Nice. That's awesome. No, we were talking just before we hit record about the joys of raising kids. You know, it's one of those things that I think many of us who have the opportunity to have kids, it kind of defines us, and we would do anything for our kids. But it's also kind of this humbling experience. So I appreciate you sharing that with, because I think it's a unifying experience. Everybody who has kids realizes what a humbling, challenging thing that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's amazing now whenever I see a young mother, a mother with young kids, right? Automatically, I think, what can I do to help? Even though it's a complete stranger, I may not know her at all. And I think it's the same thing with like a dad that's struggling with like a toddler that's throwing a fit or whatever, right? Like all of us now understand that way more than we did before we had children. So it becomes somewhat of a village. And I think that shared experience is also amazing and kind of relates to that community that maybe wasn't easily visible before, right?
Oh yeah. No, I was really smart about kids before I had kids. Lots of advice. And then you have them
Right.
and you're like, oh, I'm humbled, whatever it takes.
Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
so I want to talk just to lay the groundwork here for a minute about some of the stuff we're going to talk to with our audience. This is a really cool podcast today, and I'm excited for Dr. Helder to share with us what she's done. Just to kind of lay the groundwork of where we're going. Dr. Helder is an early stage physician who's had a unique idea or set of ideas and has been able to take them not from just the idea stage, but to actually, do a lot of work toward bringing that to help with patients. And I think that's unique. And like in my mind, I always think like, oh, that's somebody else, somewhere else, far away. But you did it. And I want to kind of go from your journey to becoming a doctor and how you did this. But I want to tell our audience that's where we're going. This is a pretty cool thing that you've been able to do as a cardiothoracic surgeon, certainly making a tremendous difference to the lives of those people who entrust you with their care. So yeah, tell
Thank
us
you.
about yourself a little bit. Tell how did you become a doctor? What made you decide to go into this path?
Yeah, so I was born in India, southern India, and actually I was raised by my grandparents for the first 5 years of my life. A little bit off topic here, but my parents had an arranged marriage, and even though my grandmother thought my mother was old enough to get married, she didn't think she was old enough to actually raise a child. And so when I was born, they kind of raised me after I was 1 years old, in a different kind of state than my parents. So I was very close with my grandparents. And my grandpa, I remember like when I was 5 years old, he was admitted to the hospital with what I think was a liver abscess. And just remember him being in the hospital for a very long period of time and then hearing that he was going to have surgery. And then really the next day he was better. And I said to myself then, I wanted to be a surgeon. And that's kind of where it all started for me. And I remembered that I moved with my parents to the US, to Colorado, and Nebraska. And then junior high school, I was really lucky enough to have, she was actually a National Honor Society like counselor. That really talked to us about what we wanted to do. And instead of saying, really, do you want to do that? She'd say, okay, let's go find some people so you can understand what that means. So I was lucky enough to be able to shadow and actually come into the operating rooms of multiple surgeons. And I went in to see a coronary artery bypass grafting,
As a
and
ju
the surgeon asked me if
as
I
a
wanted.
middle schooler, as a junior high
Yeah,
school.
yep, as an
Wow.
eighth grader. Yeah. And I remember he asked me if I wanted to scrub in. And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but yes, absolutely. And I got to wear this little white glove and hold the heart up while he did a bypass, and I was done. Like that was it. I said, this
Wow.
is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And my father-in-law likes to call me a bulldozer, I think lovingly. But in general, like when I decide that I want to do something, I think I find every excuse and every reason that that should be the case. And thankfully, it has really ended up being a great fit for me. Because I blind, what do you know in eighth grade, right? And I think that's what we tell medical students or even residents, right? We say, like, you don't really know until you actually do our rotation or, have spent some time doing this. But the problem with that, right, is especially the way our medical schools and our residencies and like, just the ranking process and everything is you don't really have the luxury of that time to truly discover, right, in medical school what you want to do. Because if you want to be an orthopedic surgeon or something competitive, right, you better have figured out exactly who's going to write your letters. You better have published all of this stuff well before the time when you pick. So I do think there is this middle ground, which is probably not what I did, but this middle ground of really having a thought in mind of where you want to end up before you really even kind of get into your clinical years so that you can invest a lot of time beyond what your medical school may allow, may give you traditionally to figure out what you want to do with your life.
Man, I love that concept of the bulldozer. That is so cool. We talked about kids before, and that's what we try to teach the kids is okay, you can be stubborn, but be stubborn for the right.
Yeah,
Say
I love that.
we're gonna try to be stubborn for the right and get it done. That's so cool. And I wish that everybody could have the opportunity for a hands-on job-related experience like you did, because I mean, what a cool thing. You got to be in the OR and scrub in as a young woman, and that's pretty cool. That's a neat
Yeah,
thing. And I can
yeah.
reflect. I grew up in a small town, and I knew I wanted to be a small town doctor from when I was very young. And I'm very boring. I just stuck with it. I'm like, that's what I'm going to do.
Amazing.
And so I've shared with some of the other listeners on this podcast when I got done with the medical training, the doctor who delivered me was ready to retire, and I came and took his spot.
That's
Isn't
awesome.
that crazy? It's just how it went.
That's amazing.
But it is nice to get a direction and know where you're headed because it does help. The earlier you can figure that out,
Yeah.
certainly the more advantageous it is for you. But well, so then you went through medical school, you got into a competitive residency if you were at the Mayo Clinic, and then obviously that led to this awesome career. I would like to hear a little bit about that process and then your early stage career as a young physician, young surgeon.
Sure. So I went to medical school at St. Louis University, and it was really we had one of the busiest ERs. We had one of the busiest trauma programs, and it really was an inner city school. where there was not enough people to really, to get the work done that needed to be done. So as a medical student, I was very much a part of the team. I remember like I actually opened somebody's chest post cardiac surgery
Mm.
that was tamponading as a third year medical student because I was literally the only one there. Because people were in the
Right.
operating room or whatever, everybody's spread so thin. So for me, I was just incredibly lucky to have a hands-on experience, and at the same time have actually two people that were just incredible mentors, are still incredible mentors. So the chief of thoracic surgery, who actually ended up being a president of our Society of Thoracic Surgeons later on. He is, he is these like just amazingly charismatic human being that you just wanted to be around him. You wanted to be like him. Everybody loved him. And it was just affirming to say, yeah, that's what I'm going to be like. And I was also very lucky. One of the cardiac surgeons there, she was a female cardiac surgeon that just came out of training. This was her first job, and I was her first medical student, right? That she wanted to, and I just had coffee with her in January, so we still are incredibly close. And to see people, like, it was one thing to say, like, I want to be a cardiac surgeon. I don't know what that's like, very abstract. And then to see somebody that looks like you, that you want to, act like, um, and what that means for, like just a little bit more digging in, right? Like it solidifies something a bit more abstract. So that was my medical school, and was lucky enough to get into Mayo for surgical training. And to be honest with you, Mayo was not my first choice, right? Just
Mm.
then, it was there was these integrated cardiothoracic surgical residencies. It was their second or third year out, and there was only four spots in the country. So there was four of these integrated programs, and they took one person each. And Mayo it was general surgery, plus you had this like inward route where you could actually basically do more cardiac than you would do general surgery. So it was a little bit more cardiac focused, but it was still general surgery plus cardiac. Um, so I was actually pretty disappointed to be going to Rochester. I really wanted to go to Stanford's integrated program, but it was one of the best things that I think could have ever happened to me. And the reason I say that is, um, I don't think I would have been mature enough 6 years through residency to become a cardiac surgeon. And I really needed that general surgical training, that chief year of general surgery, to understand what it meant to really take the responsibility of operating on a patient and seeing them through and kind of learning from any false steps and all of that, to then come to kind of this high risk field of cardiac surgery, just that mindset, that you talk about. And I think um, it did allow for a bit more of a growth mindset than a fixed mindset, right? And part of it is general surgeons know how to teach interns. I'm not, like at that stage, it was new, right? Like cardiac surgeons weren't used to teaching interns. So I think I do truly believe things happen for a reason. And I think it worked out for me the best it could have. And that Mayo network is incredible. And to have been part of that. So yeah, and then cardiac and then I thought I was going to stay in academics, and that was kind of the pathway. I took 2 years to do research, in between my third and fourth year of general surgery. So spent 2 years doing decellularized valve development, aortic valve development, and really wanted to do aortic surgery, but I wanted to do kind of the whole thing. I wanted to do endovascular aortic, I wanted to do open aortic, and a lot of kind of the academic positions that I looked at, there really wasn't this easy way to come in and bridge both, right? Because vascular surgeons were doing endovascular, cardiac was still, the open ascendings, and there was a clear divide. And I was lucky enough during my cardiac surgery fellowship to do a fair number of endovascular fellowships, but I went out of Mayo to do a lot of them. And one of those fellowships was actually in this heart hospital in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where there's this kind of pioneer. He was a diagnostic cardiologist by training, but then he went and did a peripheral intervention in Cleveland Clinic. And then he now is kind of one of the highest enrollers in most clinical trials. Related to like TAVR or TVAR or kind of aortic work. And so I got to work with him and really learned a lot from him and really hit it off well. And so he recruited me to Sioux Falls, just saying, if you want, this is the type of practice you want, you could have it here. Um, and I really was surrounded by so my first senior partner, which is, I guess, the number one thing I will say is as somebody leaving residency or fellowship, you're like, oh my God, I just want a job. No matter what the market looks like, right? Like you're like, I am in so much debt. I whatever, I just want a job. And you sometimes don't know to look at more than what are they paying me, where am I going to live, and maybe what's the call schedule look like. And there's always been this kind of cliche thing about your partners are the most important thing, but truly, how do you kind of suss that out in one interview or two interviews? And I don't know, I still don't know how you would know before, but my senior partner in Sioux Falls was somebody who was the calmest human being I've ever encountered.
That's
Like,
probably good for surgery.
yeah, absolutely. He just nothing fazed him. He was getting ready to retire in probably like three, like 4 or 5 years. And he actually worked with his dad, who was also a cardiac surgeon. So his dad had like just spent this incredible amount of time mentoring and teaching him, and he really wanted to give back. Uh, so I benefited from all of that. Right? Like I was able to like take everything that he wanted to kind of teach and learn while kind of having somebody that could get me out of trouble if I got into trouble, but allowed me to kind of build my own practice and figure out how I wanted to do things.
Oh, it's so cool.
Um, yeah, and so like I don't think like I could have asked for a better senior partner. And then just came to Minneapolis here 2.5 years ago, just from a better, like, we love food, we love traveling, and all of that is made easier in a little bigger town. So,
No, it's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. One of the things I wanted to jump back on is, again, some of the listeners on this podcast are medical students or
yeah.
early phase doctors or people who are, even just thinking about medical school. So I want to just hear a little bit, maybe just break that down. You talked about all these wonderful experiences working with different mentors. And, I think a lot of people at the beginning of this maybe don't quite understand how many hours it takes to become competent at doing something. And
Yeah.
specifically, if you say, look, I'm going to do one of the more high risk surgical subspecialties, how many hours do I need to spend in that OR? And it's thousands. And
Yeah.
I just want to kind of hear how many years of residency and fellowship, and what would you tell somebody who was considering this pathway, as far as the nuts and bolts of getting it done?
Right. So, right. So 4 years of medical school. And then if you're taking the traditional route, it's 5 years of general surgery and then either 2 or 3 years of cardiothoracic surgery fellowship. There's both 2 and 3 year programs. And then there's these kind of now different routes where you can do a 6 year, like an I6, or a 4+3, or it's a 7 year. Or you can actually now do this 5 year vascular surgery integrated residency with a 2 to 3 year cardiac fellowship. So there's all of these routes that are new. What I lost your question a little bit. So the hours kind of spent in, right? And I think it is with all of these options being available, it is being really honest with yourself, which requires a lot of insight. And to be honest, I'm not sure I had that at 20, whatever. I don't even remember how old I was when I first started medical school. Uh, about how you think you learn best, about how you master best, right? Because residency is this amazing place where you truly are meant to learn, not at no cost, right? There's a lot of cost to residency, both personal and to the patients and your mentors and your teachers. But it is at a much lower cost than when you are in practice yourself. So I actually remember Rob Serfolio, who is now in the C-suite at NYU. And he was like one of the very first pioneers of robotic thoracic surgery. And I think he's kind of a larger than life guy. But he came to Mayo because he was actually a Mayo fellow. He did thoracic surgery at Mayo, and he came back and he spoke to us. And I'd known him from something else, and he called on me and he asked me like, "What are you, what are you most excited about in residency?" And I remember saying in front of like, we were sitting in this hall that we always sat at for M&Ms and big conferences. And I remember saying in front of all of these people, like 300 plus people, well, I just can't wait for it to be done, right? Like
Well,
I have like 3 more years
right,
left.
it was a good honest answer.
Yeah. And he was like, "Well, that's ridiculous, right? Like you only have these 3 years left to learn all of this." Um, and that I'm like, okay, I guess, dude. I like the guy that now is like not a resident that gets to control his own life, that like is making money. That's easy for you to say. But there's a lot of truth in that, right? Like it really sets you up for the rest of your life of whether you're going to be this scared, anxious practitioner because you haven't really learned what you needed to do before you got out, or it kind of like, is it going to be an uphill climb in those first 1, 2, 3 years, or is it going to be like, oh yeah, I got this, right? Like, and you really get to determine that the um, based on how you approach that residency. And I think, this feels ridiculous. Like I am fairly, like I just turned 40, right? Like in the scale of things, I'm pretty young. But I did see a huge difference. So my intern year was the last year for like um, the where the hours changed for residents. So we took out of like we took call out of the hospital like as interns, and then we came back in no matter how many hours you were in the hospital the night before. We still had like the 80-hour work week, but we didn't have this 10 hours out of the like all the other things that
Right,
came in.
right.
And I think that was great, right? Like, I think it allows you to have some amount of a life and doesn't produce just like a bunch of narcissistic people that can't relate. But it did also change to a bit some people, right? Like not everybody, but some people just that this became something that you trudged through. This is something that somebody else was doing to you that you had to check off before you got to be on your own and get through it, right? Like it became more of a getting through instead of a getting to. Um, and there's got to be a great way of a compromise that somebody smarter than me is going to figure out. But it's how do you continue that? I just read a great book called Mindset. It's by Carol Dweck, Dweck. And she talks about a growth mindset and a fixed mindset in kind of all the ways, like in professionally, in how you praise your children and everything else. And just this idea that, like, just for example, like when you're praising your children, like perhaps it's better not to praise them when they get things easily or telling them how good they are already at it, but instead praise them for their effort, praise them for their trials, praise them for like sticking with it when it was hard. And I think it's that you can learn in residency, right? Because when you spend, 10 to 12 hours operating on a patient and then they end up passing, you need that, right? To like
Right.
get through and not get burnt out. That was incredibly long-winded, but
No, it's helpful. One of the things that I've reflected on as a physician, but also as a patient myself, is thinking about the people who are here to take care of me when I've been a patient have spent thousands of hours. Doesn't matter what specialty they're in or where they're at. Every one of them spent thousands and thousands of hours to be able to be there in that moment when I needed them. And, I've been a doctor for enough years that I've usually been on the doctor side of it, but being on the patient side, you're like, okay, when it's my turn, I don't want someone who just got by. I want someone who really put a lot of time and effort into it. And one of the things I want to reflect on in the surgical subspecialties, there is so much time commitment, and I think that it's honorable. It's a wonderful thing about our society that we have created this system where we create true experts who can do these amazing complicated surgeries. But you can't just learn it from a book and see one, do one,
yeah,
teach one. Like you can, but you got to see one, do one, and teach. But you got to do it again and again and again. And it
yeah.
really is a long process to learn that. And so I honor you for what you've done. That's an amazing journey that you've been on.
Thank you. I would, if you don't mind, one of these things, right? Like, so I think the statistic is still staggering. I think there's 2% of all cardiac surgeons are still female. Like, I think it's still like it's a single low number.
Really, goodness.
There's now more thoracic surgeons that are female, but like pure cardiac surgeons, it's still ridiculously low. And maybe that 2% is in academic cardiac surgery. But like I was the very first cardiac track resident at Mayo Clinic to have a baby.
Hmm.
And that was in 2019.
Wow.
So it I think there was actually one other person before, well, two, there was one right before me, but she was thoracic track, and one like 15 years before us. And she was also thoracic track. And so just this, there's always been this, well, I don't know if I want to go into cardiac surgery because I want a family and I want like this work-life balance and kind of this idea. And I was listening to this YouTube video, the PepsiCo CEO, who's a mom, a CEO of a multi whatever billion-dollar company. And she's amazing. She seems amazing. I don't know her personally. But she was talking about how uh, her daughter, like teenager, had asked her to bake cookies for something. and she'd forgotten, completely forgotten. And then the day of, her daughter like texts her to remind her and says, "Okay, are you going to bring the cookies? Now remember, it can't be these Nestle Toll House cookies, and you can't buy them, right? Like they have to be actually like homemade cookies." And so she ended up like asking the cafeteria at like Pepsi to make her cookies, and then she takes these cookies in and she ends up being like, her daughter's happy. And she was actually like, well, the people at work were actually incredibly happy, right? Like that I was reaching out in a time of need and asking these people to help me. And so, like, her whole point was there is no balance, right? Like,
Right.
work never stops and life never stops. And that's true, I think, very much so for physicians, and especially, I think, for surgeons, right? We take, like, I'm on call nearly every night that I'm at, in that geographic location, except for like every third weekend, when, like, for Saturday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I'm not. But so just this thought of that's okay, right? Like I take my girls into round with me and they absolutely love it, right? Like they love being a part of my life. They understand that what I do is important, and I think they're proud of me for that. And at the same time, like nurses see me as a human being that there's these things that I can relate to with them, right? Like that we all have shared experiences. And my patients love it. Like there is nothing like, like a little girl's laugh, right? Like that kind of helps you feel better. But like I don't think you have to have this work is done at 5 o'clock, and that's the only way to kind of have a um, well-rounded life. Like I think it's okay when things bleed into the other things. And for me, at least, like I find a lot of purpose in all of those ways. And all of that to say, like, I don't think, um, I think cardiac surgery has gotten a bad rap that you can't kind of have a well-rounded life and be a cardiac surgeon. And I think that's pretty unfair because I think if you want to be a workaholic, you can do that in any profession.
Oh yeah. Well, so I'm like I've shared. I'm a rural doctor, and so I'm
Oh
on
yeah,
call
all
all
the
the
time.
time. I've been here for 14 years, and the only time you really can't have an obligation to run into the hospital is if I specifically arrange it and say, okay, I'm
Yeah.
gone this weekend. Will you cover for me? And I have wonderful colleagues who've been so good, but it's I just think medicine will eat you alive if you let it, no matter what
Yeah.
specialty you're in. But you can just find yourself always, always, always going to the hospital. And I've had to do kind of the same thing. You just have to meld the different parts of your life. And so my kids coming round and we go to the activities at the school, and then they see me walk out from the basketball game to go back to the ER because somebody came in and, cut something off that they shouldn't have, or something. And then you go back and you're in the community again. And it's some I for sure recognize that some people wouldn't be able to do that, but I've found that when I share those just kind of personal parts of my life with people and let them know that I'm a human being and I have kids and a family, and like, people really love that. They understand that
Yeah.
I'm talking to a person, and maybe it helps create a little bit of understanding when you walk in the room and you're late, and you say,
Yeah.
but the reason I'm late, hopefully you can understand the reason I'm late is not because I've been sitting out there scrolling on social media. I'm late because the person before you was having a crisis, or I had to go to
Yeah.
the hospital because somebody was having a baby, or I was on the emergency room and somebody came in bleeding, or whatever it may be. I think that I like what you said. It's good to humanize it. I would hope for a day as we do residency training and all the different aspects of medicine that our society would let us be people. So sometimes I feel
Yeah.
like doctor. I tell my wife sometimes I'm the doctor bot 2000. I come home and
Yeah.
you've seen so many people and done so much stuff, and it can be a little bit of a dehumanizing experience. But it's so important to continue to try to reach for that human connection, because that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me, you talked about a little bit, just this, how easy it can be to burn out, right?
It can be.
And I think for me, that really comes with how isolated you can feel, um, in what drawn me back always, thus far, right, um, is that human connection with my patients more than anything else. And I remember that I operated on this incredibly gruff looking gentleman that just like wouldn't even look at me when I first walked in. And after kind of everything, it was close to, and he actually came back to see me in clinic during Christmas time. And he brought me like two little Santa tie dolls for my kids. And like I didn't even know that he was listening to anything that I was saying or, but the thing that he took home with him is that I had two little girls, right? And that's like what he remembered. So I think our patients are really looking for a way to relate to us. There is just this hope and assumption that if we offer to do something for them, that we wouldn't do so if we weren't competent, right? Like I think a lot of people just automatically make that assumption,
Right.
which is an incredible privilege. But I think it's this like the other level, right? Like this comfort as they're going under anesthesia that comes from like I have this human like relationship with somebody. Like I am more than just a room number. I am more than whatever. They know something about me that I think matters a lot. Like personally, I actually just very I had an septoplasty, which is like an outpatient procedure, but it was still a general anesthetic. And I remember as I was getting ready to be intubated, that like, I'm just like thinking, I'm like, oh my God, if I die, is my husband going to be able to take care of our kids? And like, I could just remember as like I was drifting, the CRNA saying, your husband will do great. Don't worry.
That's your parting thought. Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Well, and I just to reflect on that, I think all this leads to this concept that we have to be people, and it does help. You have to take care of your time for sure. You can burn out if you spend too much time, but it does help to not be like this automatic robotic person. It really helps to come make those connections. And I'll share just, one of the most poignant moments of my whole life. I've shared on this podcast. I had this horrible tumor that had to be cut out, and it was, it was 28 centimeters. It was huge, had to be removed, and I didn't know what my life would be like at the end of that surgery. There was no way to
Yeah.
know. And so it's exploratory laparotomy, and we'll see how it turns out. And I had very good surgeons and great anesthesia and all that stuff. But I remember in that moment talking to the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, and it was just this moment of pure, I don't even know how to describe it, just like trust and
Yeah.
release. Like I just remember just saying like, I trust that you're training, and I trust God, and I trust that it's going to turn out however it turns out, and I can't control it, but I honor and so thankful for the people that had put the thousands of hours of time in, so that when that moment came, I'm not like, I wasn't like, I'm not sure about you. I just had to
Right.
say, I fully trust you that you will do the very best thing, and you would treat me just like you would treat your dearest family member. And I still reflect on that, and it was such a powerful moment. And as doctors, we sort of take it for granted that people
Yeah.
trust us to that level, but having gone through it, when you go through it, you think like, wow, that is a moment of
Such a big
pure
deal.
trust to another person, another fallible human being, but I trust them 100%, and it's a
Yeah.
crazy moment.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, talk us through a little bit. Like I said at the beginning, you've had this
Yeah.
really interesting career thus far. And not only have you been able to take care of the patients that have presented, you have become an innovator and an inventor. It's really interesting because during a busy career, most people say, how would I have time to carry an invention or an idea to actually to fruition? And I'd like to hear about that concept, and maybe some of the nuts and bolts of maybe how other docs who have similar ideas could go about that.
Sure. Absolutely. So I'll back up a little bit. I've always been somebody that's been drawn to research. Always, I spent 2 years in the lab, did a bunch of peer-reviewed publications in training, and to be honest, I was a bit jaded in the lab, right? Like it almost felt like you were doing something to publish and not necessarily to like change.
Right.
And part of that is just that's the way the world has changed now, right? Like it is really hard um, to make life-changing discoveries go fast. Prior to the COVID vaccines, right? Like what was the last thing that went that fast? And so, when people asked me in residency, like, what do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? I would say, well, I want to be a surgeon that has a lab, as PI, whatever. And then because of this route that I went and didn't stay in academic medicine, went to private practice, that obviously became something I left behind. But I've always been drawn to that. And then, so really kind of late 2023, um, so where I operate now, we're about, 45 minutes from a metro and then about 2 hours to the next closest. So we get a big catchment of people.
Hmm.
And we end up getting a decent amount of aortic dissections. And just to, it is an incredibly deadly disease, right?
Right.
About 200,000 patients a year die from it, just underdiagnosed. There's no screening program. If there's an aortic dissection, there's an 80% chance that you won't make it to the hospital. And if you do make it to the hospital, there's an operative mortality that's about 15 to 25% nationally. And we really haven't moved the mark on that operative mortality in since 1990 in an appreciable way, right? Like there's aortic centers of excellence that are really making headways into that. But nationally, if you look at the everybody, and so I was actually getting to do a lot of these aortic dissections. And part of the incredible painful part of this is they are long cases. They are 8 to 10 hour cases. And a lot of that time is actually spent cooling the patient to, 18 degrees, 24 degrees, kind of pick your number at this point. And then rewarming them after you're done with your operation. But the whole reason that you're cooling is to decrease metabolic demand enough that you can actually shut off all of the blood flow to the body. So complete circulatory arrest. So
Hmm.
not just stopping the heart, but literally taking all of the blood out of the body, which still blows my mind
That's crazy
that,
we can survive that. Right.
yeah. But you can imagine that if you've already underwent a tremendous insult, like of this aortic dissection, if the operation to save your life also has this incredible physiologic insult of being on a cardiopulmonary bypass machine for hours and hours, not getting perfusion, being cooled down and then rewarmed. And really, the only reason that why we do it that way is because of anatomic constraints to not being able to externally control, blood flow.
Right.
And so, as I was sitting there working on a patient, rewarming, I had all the time in the world to think about this. And my husband has a shop and we just got a bunch of hoses and tubes together and like drilled and super glued them and put them in some PVC piping. And I'm like, there's got to be a way that we can perfuse the body and the brain while we can simultaneously see what we need to see to sew, right? Because the problem is if I open the aorta, there's 5 liters of blood
Right.
in
So
my
much blood
face
you could
and
never see it. Right.
right. So and that's really how I came up with this idea. It is really simple, right? Like there's no bells and whistles. It is truly just a way to perfuse the body and the brain while giving us a clear surgical field. And I thought about it. I actually wrote up a provisional patent. And once that got submitted, very wide-eyed and naive, thinking I was still at the Mayo Clinic where I could just go to the engineering department and have things made that I wanted. I went to kind of these big companies like Medtronic and Terumo under NDAs and said, "Hey, I have this great idea. Here's literally my, drawing of this."
Right. Just for clarification, NDA, non-disclosure agreement, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, just so
yeah.
everybody knows what that means.
Yep. And I said, "Hey, can we make this? Because it's going to be really cheap to make, and I promise you, it's going to affect just an incredible amount of patients' lives. And I think just economically, it'll be great for the hospitals." And I think that was the extent of my argument, right? Like it was not more than that. And they're like, "Oh, that's great." And they didn't laugh at me because I'm their customer, and so they were politically great. And they've said, "Well, why don't you go de-risk it and come back?"
Oh boy.
And I'm like, "Well, I don't know what that means." And I really had no idea what that meant. And I did a lot of research, and thankfully, I'm in maybe the best place in the world to do something like this. Minnesota is known as Medical Alley, and I know, like, San Francisco and Boston, every place fancies themselves great at med tech, but Minnesota is great at med tech and med device, right? Like, if you think about it, Medtronic is here, ATS is here, I can go on and on, and was able to really connect with a lot of people that had done this before. And I was blown away by that, that somebody would meet with me just because I had an idea, right? They weren't getting anything for their time. They weren't in, who knew, right? Like what this may lead to. And over again, I kept meeting people that just wanted to get an idea to market because they believed that it might help people, right? Like that it would help patients. And that was the first time where I actually felt ashamed, right? As a physician and as a surgeon, I think I very much up until this point thought I'm the only one that cares about patients. I'm the only one making a difference. Like industry, all they care about is money. Like, who are all these people, right? Like, they're not in it, they're not a stakeholder. And I couldn't be more wrong. Just the number of engineers and commercial folks and just everything that takes to make a medical device. Obviously, they make money, right? But I really do think that is more at the leadership level of these big companies. But the people day in and day out working on this care so much about what they do to change people's lives. And when I saw, just like, I finally felt like I was with these just like-minded people. And that's when I decided to start a C Corp, and then learned that if I really wanted to not be laughable, essentially, that I needed to have a something like a working prototype that I could show to people and have some sort of proof of concept. And so spent some money to do that, but it really wasn't that much money. I mean, I think my first prototype cost $7,000, right? And mine is not like electronic software and everything like that. But, if you think about it, that's one vacation. That's one, like, and I kept thinking about it like that. Like, this is my opportunity to really invest in myself, in my idea, and just to get, like, just for the pure curiosity of it, right? If nothing else. And that's what I kept saying every single time I put more and more money into it. And it, and at some point, I think, I did enough. So developing a prototype, but also very much had to develop this idea of like market access, like how much market potential is there, like what are the finances, how do you make money, how does a hospital actually benefit from this, how do patients benefit from this, and found a lot of advisors to help. Conned a good friend of mine into coming joining, and she's the full-time COO. And this really all happened November of last year. And in December, talked to enough cardiac surgeons and enough people in med tech where I said, okay, this is a viable business now. So then I felt comfortable. raising what we call a seed round, which is essentially like this is the money that'll help us get through bench testing and animal testing of the device. And the very first phone call I made was to an old friend that had known me for 20 plus years and I knew was doing okay. And I did my little pitch with my PowerPoint. And at the end, he was like, I'm just so proud of you. Like, of course, like when you want to do something, I know you'll do something. And I'm just so, just, I just love that you're going for
He
this
knows
and
that you're
how
the bulldozer.
right.
He totally knows.
Right. And that was just amazing and incredibly validating. And just to be honest, that's the kind of support that I've gotten more often than none. And we've raised $240,000 now of 1.5 million that we need, but we've raised that 240,000 in about 7 weeks, actually. So people tell me that's fairly fast, especially because we're incredibly lean, right? Like it's two of us and another person that's working kind of part-time. So it's just really been reading as much as I can, talking. I would say, met 500 new people in the last 4 months. And what that has meant, still being a full-time surgeon, is I've had to be incredibly thoughtful and efficient with my time and time management. And like way more, like residency doesn't even compare, right, to
Yeah,
now.
starting a business
Um,
is very busy.
yeah. So that's been also an incredible thing, but I've loved it. It's not often, well, I didn't think when I turned 40 that I would get to do something completely excitingly new, right? Like, and it's awesome to be able to do that and have the opportunity to do that. Yeah, like at the end of the day, I truly believe this can change the game and how we treat patients with aortic dissections. Like, I think the whole point of this is to be able to allow doing elective preventative surgery and make that lesser risk, so that it is available to the patient in Sioux Falls in the same way that it is available to the patient in Rochester. And to me, that's been kind of a driving light. Having worked at kind of both places, I've seen kind of the healthcare inequality that comes from just a decrease in like lack of resources, right? Not necessarily competence of physicians or lack of passion or ambition, but a lack of resources. And for me, that just, seems unfair.
Well, I think some of our best investments are things we truly believe in. I don't, you can comment to what you think other people ought to do. I don't think anybody would say, "Hey, go spend all of your savings on one idea," because it might
Yeah.
fail. But if you spend a reasonable amount of money on something that you have complete control over and you're passionate about it, I think you're going to win. I'm excited for
Yeah.
you. This is pretty cool.
Thank you.
What
Thank
would
you.
you tell to somebody else that has I think a lot of people have ideas that occur to them and they're like, oh, wouldn't that be cool if we could do this?
Yeah.
And maybe you think about it, but then you're like, oh, it's this big startup cost, and I don't know anybody who could be my
Right.
COO or who could make a prototype for me. What would you tell someone who says, look, hey, maybe I need to take my first couple steps into this journey?
Yeah. So what I would say is really pressure test your idea first, right? The first thing you should do is figure out how you could fail. And if there is a way you could fail, you want to make sure that you fail fast. And what that means is putting your idea out there in front of as many people that you think are trustworthy or with those guardrails as you can have, right? Like the provisional IP, the NDAs, and making sure they're friends of friends of friends. But you have to put it out there. It can't be this baby that you protect that nobody knows anything about. And then once you've spent kind of thousands and thousands of dollars, that's when you realize, oh yeah, I missed that. Like this isn't going to work, right? So I think the smartest thing to do is pressure test that idea in as safe as a way as possible. And then if there's something there, people come to you and you figure it out, right? Like people want to be a part of something that is new and exciting. Like startups are like um attract those people. Like they're already out there, right? Like you don't have to go out and find them. And that's been the thing that was like I really thought I knew nobody. But I made 5 phone calls, and it turns out like those 5 people knew 2 people that knew 2 other people. Your network can expand incredibly fast. But the best thing to do is make sure that that idea is something worth pursuing. Like I had an idea before this one, and to be honest, like it wasn't good enough, right? Like to actually start a business around. So it may not be your first idea, maybe your second, and maybe your third, but you learn a lot of valuable things in just having an idea and at least going through the thought process of figuring out what you would do next, even if you put no money into it.
Well, I think it's interesting because all of us can kind of discount ourselves and say, I'm just this person, or I'm just a doctor that works in this place, or I'm just whatever. But
Yeah.
it's, if you think about it, there's only, just over 1 million licensed physicians in the United States of America. And if you look across the country, and if a person says, I have this idea, you're already a small percentage of the population. And then you look within your specialty and within your area and the need of people that you've come across, you may find that you actually are someone that has, you might not know everything about it, but you know
Yeah.
a lot about that particular thing just by virtue of what you do day in and day out, and you see it.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
I think it's neat. Like again, you are a very driven person, and I think that's neat that you've taken it not just this idea that you have in the back of your mind in your journal, but that you've been able to go out and find others who are supportive and people who are not physicians who are similarly passionate about making that difference to other people. And sounds like those are really great first steps. Any other first steps you would share with anybody?
Yeah. I think that there, well, so there's a lot of these programs now cropping up across the country that are just like medical device innovation fellowships, like in each part of the country. And I've not done anything like that just because this really took legs pretty fast. But I think if you are somebody that kind of loves the idea of innovation, loves the idea of like startups or a physician kind of wanting to get in business in that side of things, these kinds of formal things really establish kind of an ecosystem or a network that you can start with, right? That will then be available to you for the future. So if you're not necessarily ready to kind of take the plunge, you can kind of set yourself up for that by doing things like this. Like the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Business it really is a part-time like you go to class like for a couple of hours a week, and then there's homework that you go do, but then you like all of it is on Zoom and remote and things like that. So it's definitely doable, and I think it's easy for all of us to be like, well, I don't have time for that. And it turns out like most of us do have the time for probably a lot more. It's just what you're prioritizing, right? Like your phone tells you how much screen time you've spent in the last week, and think about what you could be doing if you weren't just scrolling or, whatever else.
Man, I feel motivated already. This is such such a good interview. Thank you. What other any other advice or thoughts you have for our audience as we're kind of wrapping up on time? But I just think this is awesome to take the idea and not just think about it, but actually do it and give, boots on the ground sort of advice like you've given.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are kind of the main thing. I mean, I guess I will, end with one last thought, which is, and maybe it is that turning 40 has made me like more turn in and be self-reflective, right? But I think a lot of us in medicine, or me, maybe I'll just say me, a lot of my life, I really sought kind of outside validation or self-worth came from outside validation. I remember very clearly there's this 360 review, that they did every year at Mayo, and one year a scrub tech wrote, she cares too much about what others think of her. And that was so very true and still is very true. Um, but there's a lot of weight that comes with that, and a lot of others controlling the way your mood, the way that you approach anything. And for me, it really hasn't been until I started not equating my self-worth with what others thought of me, that I had the strength to kind of do some of the things that I don't think I would have otherwise.
No, that's good wisdom for life. Like we talked about at the beginning, we're trying to raise good kids.
Yeah,
And that's, if I could instill that idea in my kids and in myself and for all of us, like my worth is not defined based on how somebody perceives me. And maybe that gives you the confidence to go forward with an idea like you have, or just be the honest, straight up person that you are when you go and take care of your patients. And people love that when they see someone who's confident, not arrogant, but just confident and
yeah.
genuine and kind with people, because they're happy with who they are and they're not seeking external validation necessarily. So good advice, good wisdom. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's been fascinating. I think our viewers, our listeners will love this, and I really appreciate it. Can't wait to
Yeah,
see what you do.
absolutely.
So,
Thank you very much.
yeah, how could, if people want to follow what you're doing, how would you tell them to do so? Is there any social media or anything like that you'd want people to kind of
Yeah.
tune into?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm not great at social media. We're working on it, but most of our progress we've been just posting on LinkedIn. So the company is called Octin, Octin Health. The name of the device is the Elica device. My two girls are Elia and Annika.
Oh,
And so
perfect.
that's how Elica was formed. So we've been posting kind of on our LinkedIn page, just progress as we get there. So that's probably the best way to follow. But we also do have a website, www.octanhealth.com.
Awesome. I think you're going to get a whole bunch of people who are very interested in your work because it's so cool. Well, thank
Thank
you
you
again
very
for
much.
taking the time to share it. And I hope we catch up again in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for
Mm.
inviting me.
Bye. Thanks for tuning into the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. And thank you for what you do to help your patients and your community. Your work truly helps so many people. We produce this content to help you have the tools you need to stay in medicine and to highlight the amazing work being done by physicians around the world. Please note that while I am a physician, and many of the guests on this program are also physicians or other professionals, the discussions on this podcast do not represent my employer or any professional organizations to which I belong. This podcast is for your information and entertainment only, and should not be taken as professional advice. You should seek appropriate professional advice pertaining to your own situation. Please check out more of our content on our website, doctorsmakingadifference.com. Also, please follow, like, or subscribe on your podcast player or YouTube channel and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps to spread the message. Finally, if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, or if you'd like to nominate someone else to be a guest, please visit the website or email admin@doctorsmakingadifference.com. See you next time.